Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia CZV tutorial series. Going to be having a look at the modulations tab today. There's an awful lot to cover in this one and it looks really intimidating. When we break each section down, you'll see that there's nothing fundamentally unsolvable here. There's just a lot of it. If you're enjoying this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to do that. Okay, so for today's purposes, I've chosen this 2 oscillators preset. It's still in the template folder. It's got a little bit more meat to it than the default preset, and particularly we've got some modulations pre-mapped. So this will help me to explain this modulation matrix nice and easily with a preset that you can follow along with. The concept of a modulation matrix is that down the left hand side you've got the things that do the work, and across the top you've got the things that are affected. So here we've got the modulation wheel doing some work. It's doing some work on the vibrato depth. So if I press a note with the modulation wheel turned all the way down, you can't see the physical one, but you can see the virtual one. So here we are down, no modulation depth, turn the modulation wheel up, there's the vibrato depth. Now that depth is so intense because this modulation matrix value is at its maximum. If I drag this value down, we lower the depth by which this thing, modulation wheel, is affecting this thing, the vibrato depth. If you right click on these controls, you get really fine control over them. You can also, I don't think I've said you can control click in these boxes to get fine control as well, but I generally tend to right click. You can also see that as we head up to 0, we've got a nice color coding representation, and you can also go negative. Don't forget that you can always go negative with these values. Many of the modulation destinations are unipolar. So for instance, vibrato has no concept of negative modulation. So you're only going to get an effect with this particular setting if you're in positive territory. You can also map individual sources to multiple destinations. So here we have the 4 macro sliders. These are these controls in the main interface, and you can see that each of them, well, macros 1 and 2, have been mapped to 2 different effects. This sound utilizes both line 1 and line 2, and you can see that the digital control wave is being modulated by the same slider in both instances. Just turn my mod wheel down so we've not got a vibrato. And as I turn the macro up, you can see both DCWs being modulated simultaneously. If I double click on either of these values, it'll reset it to 0. And now this macro slider is only going to affect line 1. Now DCW is a bipolar effect, so if I set line 2 to -1, the amount of these 2 DCWs is going to be inversely proportional by the same slider. So you can see at the lower limit, line 2 is fully modulated, line 1 is unaffected, and vice versa. All of this stuff that you're seeing in the tab, this was not in the original synthesizer. This is stuff that's been added by Arturia. You can also have multiple sources affect the same destination. So for instance, I could map my mod wheel to line 1 DCW. And now if I choose line 1, I get the list of options down here. Here's line 1 DCW. And now either of these things, the mod wheel and macro 1, are going to affect the same destination. Don't forget, you can never go past 1. So if the sum of these 2 things gets to 1, irrelevant, the rest of it's going to get thrown away. Just going to adjust the DCW envelope for this sound. I'm going to take it down completely so that now the DCW knob is the only thing that's actually doing any work. It's going to let me show how these 2 modulation sources merge together. So mod wheel all the way down, macro slider all the way down, virtual sine wave. Now start increasing the slider. There's some of the DCW being applied. Modulation wheel, there's more of the DCW being applied. Eventually we're going to max out, and now this extra little bit of the slider that I've got to go isn't doing any work. You can see that at about, it's 44% in value, but it's about two-thirds of the way up the slider. So you can basically adjust these 2 modulations such that you just peak out at the maximum modulation amount when both of them are up to full. That's just obviously a salt to taste kind of thing. Let's throw all of those changes away and get back to the original preset sound and turn my mod wheel down so that it's not silly vibrato. Onto the right hand side of this screen now. Very busy, there's lots going on here. There's basically three different sections to look at. The first is this pair of LFOs. So these are completely generic low frequency oscillators that can be assigned to any destination. So let's simplify this preset by turning line 2 off. Now we've got a nice simple sound. I'm going to map this LFO, which as you can see is cycling at this speed. This is a genuine visual representation. And I'm going to overwrite this mod wheel setting. And if I scroll down my available sources, eventually I'll find LFO1. And now I've mapped LFO1 to the vibrato depth. Now let's map this destination somewhere else. Let's say master tune. So that's going to be essentially a vibrato effect. Very slow at the moment. Let's speed it up. And pull the effect down a little bit. Just built ourselves a rudimentary vibrato there. Slow it down a bit so that we can see more easily what's going on. Lots of different waveforms to choose from. Most of them are pretty straightforward. Sample and hold, as always, is the odd one out. So a sample and hold generator basically takes like a control voltage snapshot and holds it for a period of time specified by our rate. Now this sample and hold generator is internal to the LFO. Over on the right hand side you can see a separate module. We'll have a look at that in a moment, but this thing is internal. It's basically just constantly generating random values from -1 to +1. So I can now map this to my master tune instead. Speed it up a bit. You can hear all of those pitch variances taking place randomly. Modulating pitch is very good for illustration purposes because it's really obvious what's going on, but it's not a particularly musical effect. If we switch to line 1 DCW instead, it's going to have a tonal variance. There we go, that sounds pretty cool. At the moment we're synced, but obviously we could choose a free-flowing sample and hold rate. 5 times a second. And we have some key trigger options down here. It's not immediately obvious what's going on here. In order to demonstrate this first value, I'm going to switch us back to sine wave. Much easier to demonstrate if it's pretty obvious what's going on. Okay, at the moment the LFO is cycling infinitely. You can see it's basically just going in the background, but I can specify how many times each time I press a key that this thing will happen. So for instance, if I set my key trigger to 4, now I'll press a key. You get 4 oscillations of the LFO and then it flatlines. New key. We also have a fade in time which specifies how long to wait before applying the LFO. But unfortunately, this value here, the key trig value, always happens instantly. So for instance, if I set my fade in time to 2 seconds and press a key, you only get the tiniest blip, which is at the very end of the LFO phase. I'll just set myself back to infinite mode. Now it's going to wait 1.7 seconds before slowly introducing the LFO. It's a gentle introduction. Now you can see the lead in time. So it's a very nice way to introduce vibrato is a perfect example where you play the constant note and wait for a couple of seconds and then gently introduce the warble. In addition to the 2 low frequency oscillators having the ability to sample and hold, the dedicated sample and hold unit is a little bit more powerful. If I switch to sample and hold instead, because this module allows you to specify the input source. So effectively what the LFOs are doing is they're using a hardwired noise generator, which is randomly selecting a value between +1 and -1 every time the hold period expires. So as things stand, this is going to have exactly the same effect. There you can hear the tonal effect on the DCW in exactly the same way as when we did it with the LFO. But if I switch to an LFO as an input source instead, take that fade in value away. Now you can see the sample and hold generator, which is cycling twice as fast as the LFO, is taking two different snapshots, which are always exactly at plus whatever this value is and minus whatever this value is. So it's effectively drawing a square wave. It's drawing a flat line for a period of time, then changing its mind, taking the new snapshot, which is always at exactly the same period. If I slow the LFO right down, we now get this really cool stepped effect. Where it's applying the modulation to the DCW, tracking the LFO, but in quantized time steps specified by the rate of the sample and hold module. All control voltages are just plus anything from +1 to -1. There's this constantly variant rate. The line 1 input, for instance, is an oscillator. So when I press a key, that generates an input, which is now this thing that's cycling hundreds of times a second. And every 16th of the DAW time, sample and hold is taking a new snapshot of that thing, which is effectively a kind of pseudo-random generator, but it's tailored around the frequency of the pitch that's currently being played. A little bit headbending, didn't mean to get that deep then. The smooth effect, let's get back to something a little bit simpler. So we've got these very sharply quantized values at the moment. If we introduce smoothing, we just round off those effects. You can see it's starting to round them off. And it basically slews from one value into another rather than having a hard jump. We get a much more organic kind of modulation. And if we engage key trigger, it basically ignores the syncing completely and takes its input from when you press the key. So when I press the key, whatever state the LFO is currently at, that's going to be the snapshot that gets taken. And then we stick there until I press a new key when a new snapshot's taken. So if I press lots of keys, you can see the sample and hold generator tracking the LFO in the background. We'll deal with combinates last. Just before we do, I'll very quickly jump over to envelopes. I'm not even going to put a physical demonstration of this. These envelopes are identical to all of the envelopes we saw when we looked at the synthesis engine. With our pitch, DCW and amplitude curves, we also have this fourth mod envelope. So whatever I draw in the mod envelope window is going to be represented. It's just basically another kind of best of or truncated view of a master window somewhere else. So let's get back to combos, and now we'll deal with Combinate, which we've left till last because it's the most complicated, but it's not the end of the world really. The easiest way to demonstrate combinates is to connect two LFOs together. So we've got these two LFOs cycling at different speeds. With this slightly unintuitive terminology, source and mod, don't worry too much about that. Basically just treat them as two modulation sources that are going to be combined together using a mathematical formula. The formula is this type option. So you've basically got plus, minus, multiply, divide, and this is a crossfade. Now, unfortunately, there seems to be an interface bug in my instance of CZV because I can't ever get anything to appear in this box. If I select plus, for instance, what you should see here is this. So you can see these various different types here, sum, diff, multiply. I don't get to see them. So you just have to basically remember or use the visual display to tell you what's going on. So these two LFOs, LFO1 plus LFO2, are being combined to make this cumulative wave. When I introduce the amount, this is how much they're being added together by. So if we multiply them, you start getting some really complex results because the mathematical processes behind these two waves, particularly if you take them out of sync with each other, now you get in a genuinely complex multiplication as these two things, totally unrelated waves, their values, their control voltage values are being multiplied together to give this composite output. That can then be used as a source in our modulation matrix, and now this wave is going to be the thing that modulates our DCW. So you can see it generates far more complex, smoothly generated waveforms. Sample and hold, it very often has this kind of random aspect to it. The combinator is always going to follow this fluid mathematical structure. Pluses and minuses are generally just going to be bigger versions of the thing that was happening in the background. Multiply and divide are the ones where you're going to get kind of fruitier results. And crossfade, as you can see, it merges the two together smoothly, so you've got a much more gentle form of modulation. And we made it. That's all the modulation options done. Please hit like if you enjoyed the video. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.